Thanks for joining on this lovely spring day. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Phoebe Lickwar. I'm an associate professor in landscape architecture here at the school. Please join me in welcoming Ross, Altheimer and Maura Rockcastle from 10 by 10. We're so pleased to have you with us today. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction. 10 by 10 was founded in 2015, and it's a transdisciplinary landscape architecture and urban design practice grounded by a shared curiosity and passion for experimentation, storytelling, and agency. Maura Rockcastle has a background in large-scale public projects, including the High Line, Shelby Farms Park, and Times Square reconstruction. Prior to co-founding 10 by 10 with Ross Altheimer, she practiced at James Corner Field Operations, Snøhetta, and Tom Leader Studio. She holds a BFA in sculpture and printmaking from Cornell University and an MLA from the University of Pennsylvania. Ross Altheimer has led the completion of numerous cultural, campus, and public realm projects, including the U.S. Capitol Complex Master Plan and the St. Louis Art Museum. He was the Director of Landscape Architecture at HGA and an associate at Cohen Partners. Ross was a 2014 Cleveland Fellow at the University of Minnesota's College of Design and the 2013 Rome Prize Fellow in Landscape Architecture. Ross has a Bachelor of Science in Architectural Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and a Master of Architecture and Master of Landscape Architecture from the University of Virginia. So please join me in welcoming Ross and Maura.
Okay, can you hear me? Fantastic. Turned it on. Good afternoon, everyone. We're really excited to be here this afternoon. Thank you so much to Phoebe for inviting us down. We were just chatting about how excited we were to go see green things in warm air, and it's still snowy and icy in the north. That's where we're reporting from. Speaking of icy in the north, you're probably wondering, what about flows, rushes, and slows? Maura and I were down at the national conferences here in San Francisco, and after about 2 days, we were sitting in another lecture, and around 3 p.m. on a sunny day, we couldn't make any more listening in the conference. So we decided to go across to SF MoMA to see the Julian Cherrier show. This particular installation was on a film and objects that came from studying the Arctic, in particular the larger set of forces at play bearing witness to light melt material shifts. It was one of the most beautiful, stark, immersive experiences we had in our time down there. And for us, I think we've been thinking a lot in the projects that we'll be talking about today. Some of the kinds of things that we experienced there and sort of referencing. Cherrier was referencing in his work, The Book of Underland, a deep time journey by Robert Macfarlane. Macfarlane recounts journeys into the subterranean of Europe and shrinking polar ice caps. And what struck us about this work in both is that the language and process they were using to describe the forces and the subterranean very much resonated with what we are after in our work. And two of the projects we'll talk about today. But instead of the subterranean, the things that are literally underneath our feet on the surface, but often go unseen. So sort of it as a kind of metaphor. And so some of the things here, deep time, movement and dynamics, light and darkness, sort of search for knowledge, places that are lost or that we fear to lose, or places that have been buried. So as I mentioned, we are based in the north, Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're about to celebrate our 8th birthday this April. This is often a point of discussion when we originally got started. We're made up of about 17 amazing people. We're a women-led practice and currently about 70% female and 30% male. The last 3 years of growth and change, moving through the pandemic and through bearing witness to the events that unfolded in Minneapolis and across our country following the murder of George Floyd, we shifted focus and spent significant time on embracing the idea of radical transparency as a practice, on seeking the best ways to evolve and to challenge how we work and to do better. We actively seek ways to sustain joy in what we do and to create a healthy culture and office where people want to be, stay, and grow and continuously evolve. We focus on projects that engage the physical, perceived, and dynamic issues of our time. We actively question how our way of working, designing addresses these issues. Through design inquiry, experimental methods of design process, and provocative questioning. And some of the issues of our time are sort of up here. And I think we hope to demonstrate a little bit to you today how we move through those, through some of our methods in our practice and in our work. How we work is a strategic choice. As landscape architects in private practice, we are all constrained by professional and economic norms, but we can choose how we work and how we want to challenge those norms. We are actively working on doing better at so many things, among them being transparent as possible. And as a field, we need to do better at building healthy design culture around all of these things. We believe design is an act of optimism. We celebrate our approach to the work that we do through gratitude and love. But that doesn't mean we don't acknowledge that this work is hard and that we face huge challenges as a field.
Okay. Transitioning, hopefully that mic is smooth. So we use a variety of methods and approaches to explore, question, decode, reveal, and test. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we think about that, and then we're going to show a whole bunch of different methods we use, and then we'll deep dive into 2 different projects. And we're excited for your questions, so keep that in mind as we work through this. Questioning, as you'll see, is really important to us. It's foundational, so start thinking of some good questions for us. So all of the methods that we use are preceded by this idea of resetting or unlearning and acknowledging all of the things that we don't know. So committing to an unfixed and very open-ended process of discovery really requires that we choose to practice observing and documenting and translating as a critical way of seeing. So how do we get there, and where do we, 10 by 10, begin? Kaina Lesky is a professor in the Department of Architecture at RISD, and in her book, The Storm of Creativity, has anybody heard or read that book? Phoebe? It's great. I highly recommend it. She talks a lot about this idea of unlearning and how our practice can defy and challenge the typical structures and modes of contemporary practice through a more process-based approach to the work. So she writes, there we go. That when you kind of rid yourself of preconceptions through unlearning, there's this absence that's left behind. And that absence really creates both a need and an awareness. And so the unlearning can then unfold in a way that it is generative, that it creates. So the impulse to know becomes kind of a spark. And we love this grounding, and from the beginning of 10 by 10 have kind of asked ourselves, how do we create generative points of departure for our work? What methods are we committing to as a landscape architectural practice to really ensure that we begin in this way? How do the methods we deploy encourage us to shift our perspective, to remain open, and to embrace detours along the way? And how can the work lead then to more positive impacts? So embracing creative methods as a way of working not only catalyzes design innovation, but can also be used as a productive tool for community outreach and civic participation, kind of measuring impacts and collaborating across disciplines. So when we say curious methods, we're describing, again, a wide range of methods, and we'll move through those here. I wanted to also note our friend Karen Lutsky is an associate professor in the landscape department at the University of Minnesota, and we've collaborated with her on a couple exhibitions and kind of research questions. She writes a lot about curious methods as landscape practices that probe but do not prove, and that ask questions rather than aim to extract meaning. So in addition to these methods and this kind of idea of unlearning, questions, as I mentioned earlier, are really key in framing what we need to do and how we might approach it. So without the questions, we really lose the rigor associated with design inquiry. We believe that if you're not asking a question as you move through your design process, the work might not push boundaries or serve the mission. For us, we're a mission-driven practice, so that's really important. So again, we ask a lot of questions about our field in general, our own practice, about each project and each site. So the projects we'll share today each have their own unique questions, and we'll get at those a little bit. But these are some of the places that we tend to start. So the first kind of strategy for creative methods to help reset and unlearn, recording is one of those. So film, photography, putting in motion kind of experiments or studies that preserve, or presence rather, unseen phenomena, working with dry ice, for example, in the river, revealing water flows and wind in these recordings in ways that still photographs would not have captured. And we've utilized film and recordings in a lot of meetings over the last several years with elders or in community kind of events where we're in a room like this where we don't have access to the stuff we're actually talking about. So we sort of bring the sounds, the color at least, into the room with us. Photographing. In this particular project, the team was using their cameras and a kind of set of rules they had established to move through a forest in Wisconsin. This is one of Ross's projects, so you can correct me if I have these wrong. But it's for a new wellness retreat on privately owned land in northern Wisconsin. So each team member sort of walked through the woods, challenged themselves to move through the woods by following more of their senses, seeing what pulled them through these different conditions. They photographed the sky and the ground after a set number of paces. They recorded their walk on Strava. And they noted when they sort of transitioned between different vegetative communities, when they crossed paths of other human-made or animal-made interventions.
You nailed it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Assemblage. So if photographing is step one, kind of taking those photographs back into your studio space or your office space, and reassembling them is also a creative act. Our bodies experience the landscape largely while in motion. And so we're really interested in methods of documentation that are revealing distance and time and that bodily movement and spatial positioning. For this project, it was a master plan for Cedar Lake and Lake of the Isles in Minneapolis, 2 urban lakes. We wanted to set up a method of documentation that would go against the grain of that kind of persistent mode of circulating clockwise or counterclockwise around the lakes. So these transects go from the parkway to the lake edge or across the lake, depending on the season, and are intended to kind of expose or explore that space of liminal wetness at the lake edge. So they're the same transect at the top, how far you can get in the summer if you're not willing to swim or have a boat, and then in the extent of distance you can cover in the winter. Below, a series of tape transects, so we have a couple more of those in here we'll look at. But those photographs were taken every 20 paces along the transect, facing forward with the lake on the right side of our bodies. One photo at eye level, one photo of the ground below. I think with that idea of spending time across seasons in different ways of documenting transects, there's this other deeper idea of just spending time and what that means. And there's such a value of learning over time when we give ourselves more. This was another discovery series we did at the lakes during the early pandemic, so we also had no choice and no option but time. There was a lot of that. So we asked, how does the edge between land and water change over the course of a year? And both, how does our experience of it as a horizon, as well as our experience of it as an edge condition, shift? And then we each took turns. There were 3 or 4 of us on the project, visiting the lakes once a week for an entire year, because we had that kind of time. And some of the post kind of processing, too, once we have all this, is looking at how to trace or draw out some of the unique qualities, the very different qualities over the seasons. Touching. When we think about how we can capture the essence or the authenticity, the character of the places we're working, it starts to spark creativity across a range of different media. So on the left are more of those tape strips, just 3 inches, 3M tape smashed onto the ground, and see what you get. The right side are plaster casts, clay slab imprints from objects or surfaces or people that are of a particular place. And we keep these sort of material echoes around us in the studio, and they come back at different points in the process, either as details or finishes or surface textures. You'll see some of these pop up in the projects. So drawing using materials of the site, the ice, the river water, the mud, the plants, the qualities and information that emerge from getting more intimate with each of the things that make these places unique. These emerged from questions like, how does water move through mud versus sand versus plant materials? How can we experience the dynamism of the floodplain as it changes across the seasons by capturing the wetness and the temporality present here in different ways? And these initial questions then lead to different threads of inquiry and further research around biodiversity or flood mitigation or cultural relationships to the land or sediment reduction. These are all along the Minnesota River edges. Other questions are, when we're looking at these mud and graphite drawings, mud on the right, graphite on the left, combination of different materials, mylar or watercolor, we can start to play with absorption or saturation across different media. You start working the materials in the way you're thinking about the landscape, or I do anyway. But holding that simple idea of legibility or performance of a line between wet and dry, it allows you to kind of hold that for a moment, to play with it, to work between the different materials of the paper, one that absorbs water, one that doesn't, and think about the values or impacts of registering or blurring an edge, how to give it more room to exist. So I think we use these materials in ways that we think about landscape. Language and words are also a very powerful creative method. How do we shake free preconceived notions of a place or a type of landscape? We need to be able to identify the biases that we're carrying with us as we do this work. We often need to also help others see the biases they're carrying with us through community engagement or conversations with our clients or our collaborators. And words are some of the best ways to acknowledge these complexities or truths defining the land upon and around which we're being asked to work, where ownership maybe is more unclear or untrue or contested. And as we consider what methods to use as we study different sites, it's important to also ask ourselves continually who we're designing for, how are these drawings being read and understood by the people we're working with. For this particular project, drawing lines and boundaries around landscapes that are sacred or fluid, this is all part of Dakota Homeland. Those kinds of line work or those kinds of edges don't make sense. They didn't make sense for the communities we were working with. So we tried to test a lot of different methods for how to represent this idea of water or deep time and cultural history, things that cannot or should not be drawn and defined by lines or maps. We're also testing how we can kind of work with communities in using these same methods, inviting them to participate in the creative work with us. This community tracing method was led by Katie Kelly in our office, who was really interested in discovering kind of rituals of practice or relationships that the community members had with, again, Lake of the Isles, Cedar Lake. So she gave community members a clipboard with a map and a sheet of vellum, oriented them to where they were standing, asked them to draw kind of how they use the lakes, where they linger, how they move, what places they are drawn to most, what places they come back to most, and to circle all the places that they love, and then told them to tell us a story about their drawing.
We also collect a lot of things, as you could probably see from the previous slides, water samples, soil cores, and materials across the site. And another thing we ask about these processes too is how they connect us more deeply to the material, to the medium, to these sort of stories. You can see Katie again in the middle trying to get some soil out of a really hard pan situation. Some capsules that are filled with a series of collections of pieces from different landscape sort of rooms at a particular site. And so again, we bring these things back to the studio with us to like bring again the site, to surround us with the site and to be inspired by these collections. Another way we work often is to employ methods of collage as a way of understanding our projects. This collage is for a historic site and a fountain that had become abandoned, and we were trying to get the client to kind of see what the opportunities were, or what they had, or what was existing, the essence of kind of the site. So this idea of sort of reduction and representation of what was existing really helped us to kind of hone in on what the critical elements of this site were. Also, the act of decoding. We also make maps to give form to those things that are hard to understand or are hard to see in their relationship to time and context. So here we're mapping George Floyd Square at 38th in Chicago to understand the occupation and community program that has emerged sort of on its own over the last 2 years. Here we're asking, how has access, artwork, offerings, memorials, gatherings, and community-led programming changed the way space is experienced and for whom? So as a beginning point for understanding this place. And this also goes a lot around with sort of both storytelling and truth-telling. This is a set of maps we're doing in partnership with the Heritage Studies program at the University of Minnesota. This is a MnDOT map. It's called a takings map. So these were houses that were moved as part of the 35W freeway building. And so here we're taking the MnDOT maps and we're sort of recoding them so you can see what houses were demoed, what houses got moved outside the city, what houses got moved into the city, to sort of trace those stories and those materials and their locations. And then just in general, we use these processes to tell stories. So some of the work that we're continuing to do is to keep pulling stories together about the life of the people who were living in the takings map and what happened to them. There was a justification about the freeway project that basically said there's no functioning community here. And so we're spending some time and working on a grant right now with the University of Minnesota and the College of Design to prove that there was a functioning community here. So we're digging back into archives, placing those stories within the site, connecting people and these stories together to kind of disprove this base notion. Okay.
So the first project we're going to dive into, it's actually two-part. It's at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. It's one of the nation's only higher education institutions in which all their programs and services are specifically designed to accommodate deaf and hard of hearing students. So the project questions, what types of spatial strategies can create a heightened visual tactile means of spatial orientation to deepen sensory knowledge for all? I think, and that's kind of on this premise that deaf people create new modes of knowing, of seeing, and of making that are unique to the world. So this project was a competition, an international design competition that we were part of, invited to join with Mass Design Group. So we were one of 4 finalist teams, and it was a 4-month design process. We actually did that 4-month design process twice, but that's a separate lecture. But our team was led by Jeff Mansfield, bottom left, who is a deaf architect who leads Mass's Deaf Space and Disability Justice Lab. And our team included 3 sensory artists, sort of each of them focused on a different sense. So Chisato Minamimura and Sarah Pickthall are choreographers and visual artists. Wendy Jacob is a sound artist, and Cecil Tulas is an olfactory artist. They helped us actually both be on our team for the design competition, but they helped us craft some really cool workshops, community engagement workshops, stakeholder university workshops that I'll talk about in a moment. So the original campus is designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. It's kind of the bottom left-hand quadrant of the campus. It's a historic district on the National Register. So a few of the key ideas for the competition, and then we're working on the pink dot represents the Louise B. Miller Memorial that we just finished construction drawings for. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the competition to set up some of the thinking for that memorial. But the idea for the competition was to reimagine that historic core, open up the western edge of the campus, kind of in that whiter zone, to some new development on that west side, in collaboration with a local developer. I think this work also preceded a lot of the amazing work that Alexa von Brainerd, who is a deaf landscape architect, has been doing and publishing, which if you're interested in kind of this sort of how to how to understand landscape through a deaf perspective and what that means for deaf space and deaf scape principles, you should look up her work. She did a bunch of research as part of an LAF fellowship, Design with Disabled People Now, a toolkit for landscape architects and planners to create accessible and inclusive landscapes. And it's really amazing work. So I just wanted to acknowledge that she's also been deepening a lot of this work, and we didn't have access to that yet as a part of this process. But the university was at this point when they started this competition, which the entire kind of global and visually performed realities of the deaf community were being drawn to the surface. And they felt that their campus was, because it was fenced off and very formal, kind of very Olmsted in its character, it was also very other. It was very separated from the city, from the community. So breaking down those barriers was a big part of this competition. And one of the ways we started is they welcomed us onto campus and put us through a series of sort of workshops where we explored knowing through touching and feeling in a very different kind of sensory, visual, tactile way. I've never touched so many people in one day. It was gentle and intentional and respectful, and it was unlike anything I've ever experienced. It was amazing. The second time we came back, we were in charge of sort of hosting those stakeholders. And so we developed a series of 3 sensory workshops. The first one was this visual workshop where we had sort of a dark space with a projector and multiple projectors to set up what was called a visual echo. So you can kind of see gradients of the shadows of me moving through that space just to give a sense of how it worked. People kind of experienced this film room and then went out onto campus with a partner and a camera and photographed sort of moments of pause in the landscape, and then came back and kind of mapped those and had some conversations around them. The second sensory experience kind of was around sound and vibration. So we set up subwoofers with different soundtracks, hip hop, opera, classical music, monkeys chattering, heavy metal, and you could feel the difference in vibrations between those different sound inputs. So the next slide might be a little loud. Not too bad. So you can see that string bouncing a little. It doesn't quite give you the same sense, but when you had your hands on that balloon, you could feel it. And even though we tried to have sound deprivation headphones on hearing people so that you could really understand what the difference in vibration felt, it almost worked, but there was something powerful about it, even though we're not getting the full experience, of course. The third sensory kind of workshop was olfactory. So Cecil created these 3 never to be smelled before scents. And this particular one, I think, got on my coat and has stuck with me for far too long. It was a combination of grape soda and wintergreen gum. Other people said it was like pine sol, but we planted these. We asked individuals inside to go inside this dark room with just these smells, and then we sent them on a walk through the landscape where we had already planted those smells to see whether they could connect with it or find it again. So yeah, again, trying to kind of understand what that memory recall of the olfactory experience was, and kind of just the distance of that scent and how it moved you through or impacted you in the landscape. And then we tried to map these things. So understanding how sensory inputs affect the way, again, we move and experience our exterior environments. Once we awaken those body senses to a deeper sense of awareness, a deeper place of awareness. And there's a very human scale to each of these senses. So we were trying to map and understand the nuances between them and think about how that could kind of come back then to what we were being asked to design. So overall, the campus redesign approach was organized around 3 larger primary ideas. Preserving and restoring the historic foundations as a national historic landmark. That's really important. Activating and empowering through new connections, so respectfully breaking the boundaries of the walls to welcome the city into the campus and vice versa, kind of creating a bilingual and bicultural exchange between the university and the neighborhood, and reconfiguring that sense of isolation that we were hearing was very present for the deaf community inside the walls. heightening interaction through a bilingual zone, creating sensory paths and rooms. And kind of as a historic district, what we were limited by in terms of what we could change or not change was pretty strict. So how to embed some of these new sort of sensory moments within that existing infrastructure, keeping the scale of those the same, just thinking about how to integrate new into what is sort of significant and needs to be preserved. So you can see in the proposal, these sensory pathways are all coded in pink, kind of nested into that historic framework and deployed across the campus. And the intensification of areas that were just sort of defined as a series of more sensory intense rooms. So the proposal also started to spatialize the idea of cultural immersion through 5 stages of deaf experience, which are kind of outlined on the bottom. So from the streetscape all the way in the very western edge of campus, beginning with awareness, and as you moved into and towards campus, this idea of heightening, of vulnerability and experimentation, which is where the sensory rooms really existed, and then into campus, this idea of fluency. And Jeff Mansfield was really the person who kind of was behind this idea of spatializing this particular set of stages of the deaf experience. And this idea of putting this bilingual zone, the pink zone, sort of situated behind the development and between and at the edge of campus. And what did that actually mean? So this bilingual zone is really, as I mentioned, vulnerability and experimentation. So these sensory rooms are coded here, orange, green, pink, and blue. One is for sound, one is for sort of light, visual commons. And so each of these rooms were developed in collaboration with those artists again. And we're trying to kind of display different ways that you can interact with each other or with the public realm based on a different set of sensory knowledge. And each of those rooms had a little bit of a more detailed axon about what was happening in those. We used light poles, or sort of just a typical infrastructural field of light poles as an armature. So these smaller light circles embedded sets of sensory poles. In this case, colorful illuminated fiberglass with motion sensing triggers that intensify the more bodies pass in and out of it. Visual Commons is sort of designed in the spirit of the campus's history as a place of protest, where bilingual communication could be made at a more of a performative and large scale space. And then moving into the work we've just finished through construction documentation. We didn't win that competition, but I think the work we did for that competition both started a dialogue between our 2 teams, Mass and 10 by 10, and created a relationship with the university that led to this memorial. So in 1952, Louise B. Miller, who's a black mother of 3 deaf boys and 1 hearing daughter, and a group of other parents filed a class action suit against the Washington, D.C. Board of Education for the right of black deaf children to attend the Kendall School, which was the deaf school on the campus of Gallaudet. And schools in D.C. were segregated by law at that time, including their only school for deaf children. And so up until this lawsuit, deaf and blind black residents of the district were sent to the Maryland School for the Blind in Baltimore, which is 2 hours away, at their own expense. So in 1953, in the summertime, Louise won her case. The U.S. District Court for D.C. ruled in their favor. So this Miller versus Board of Ed stated that African Americans should not be sent outside a state or district to obtain the same education that white students could have. And it's a powerful civil rights story that until now, until this project, has sort of been historically overlooked by the university. So we've been working with an incredible team of black deaf faculty, staff, and alumni at Gallaudet who've been leading this project within the university for years. 2 of Louise's children, Gerald and Carol, are both on this kind of guiding committee. Again, we're joined by Mass in collaboration for the memorial part. 10 by 10 is really leading a freedom garden that surrounds the memorial. And then we have an amazing cohort of consultants and lighting designers and engineers with us. So the fundamental question for this memorial is, what does Black deaf space look and feel like, and how can we honor the Black deaf experience in the landscape? We're also working with a team of Black deaf co-developers for all the content development, the storytelling, and the narratives that are showing up. And of course, a whole bunch of community engagement, all virtual, to define all of what you're about to see. So the Kendall Division II School is on the right, compared to other historic buildings on the campus. So you get a very clear sense of how even the architecture contributed to a sense of abundance for white students and something entirely different for the Black students. Gallaudet University is committed to confronting this past and helping to lead more of a national reckoning with the destructive legacy of segregation. This memorial is a big part of that. This quote, "A ramble is a process of discovery occurring in multiple paths," was captured from one of the Black deaf Gallaudet alumni. And he talked a lot about, Martin Luther King's quote that the line of progress is never straight. And this became a really driving concept for the project. And again, with Jeff Mansfield, this idea of spatializing this experience is really important to him. And so these early sketches kind of helped to organize what ideas we were trying to spatialize in this garden: awareness, freedom, remembrance, and healing. So each of these stages of experience is kind of moving through a sequence similar to what you saw us doing in the competition. But that same idea of kind of creating an awareness of Black deaf people and their lived experience, kind of as you enter this garden, moving through the idea that freedom and Miss Miller's advocacy kind of brought to the city's Black deaf students, then moving into remembrance of that courtroom struggle for justice and the reverence for her strength, and then healing as you kind of move back into campus. So we dug up a lot of those sensory studies we had done. We did some more series of tactile studies on clay tablets to think about methods of visual communication and how to make physical the need for visual tactile information, how to celebrate sensory knowledge through patterns or textures, or just even simply the acknowledgement of our hands. I'm even like talking with my hands even more as I'm talking about this project, but touching as, again, a primary mode of communication, and how do we embed that in everything that this project needs to be? So again, the simple idea of sensory paths and sensory rooms through engagement, kind of understanding that Gallaudet has too many open, passive, and empty spaces. There's no place for small groups or intimate gatherings. There are no places to sit, or maybe very few, and there are no Black deaf landscapes. So we worked with them, the community, to define what sizes and how many of those spaces are needed. We started to organize those within the garden along, again, this kind of serpentine, not straight route through the garden that culminated in the memorial. So you get a sense for what some of these rooms started to be. This is the largest room, the kind of classroom. Again, everything is sort of in the round. There's a lot of circles, a lot of visual sort of clarity around these spaces where you can see somebody standing and signing, maximize your ability to see them. The freedom path kind of meanders through the garden to create an experience that really embodies this circuitous fight for freedom, and it connects visitors to a series of sensory rooms. And then a very straight path that has kind of the more formal timeline of this fight for freedom along it. We were really working with how does the materiality of the project, again, show up to contribute to this narrative. So this gradient of blues moving from awareness, freedom, remembrance to kind of healing was, we started testing and trying to understand that through gradients of materials. Did color resonate to our stakeholders as a way of helping to communicate that or not? And it turns out it did. Also the scale and size and the qualities of the edges. How many kind of barriers did you encounter along this trail, this pathway? So you kind of see here the main trail cutting right through the rendering, the circuitous trail through the Freedom Garden meandering through. We did a lot of research on just sensory planting and relationships being kind of embedded within planting or adjacent to it. All the different kind of colors are showing up as the different olfactory and tactile qualities of these plants that were really carefully kind of curated and integrated throughout the garden. More of that research and understanding time, when these plants would be blooming and unfolding across the seasons and what colors. This was really critical for our stakeholders to understand what the heck we were doing, and kind of communicate, like, yes, we are making this something that's going to sort of be sensory rich across the seasons. They also, requested diagrams like this, really visually clear diagrams to code plant choices and materiality. We want to understand how this is changing across the season. Could kind of see in the final rendered site plan, just again, that gradient, a color palette of the paving materials, and moving into this space of really rich, dark, kind of dark black granite, and a celebration of that. Interpretation and sort of sculpture is another big layer of this garden. So shifting the power of storytelling to help, reveal and spatialize the narratives that have been overlooked. So thinking again about kind of interwoven perspectives, and moving from that idea of deprivation to abundance of information, abundance of feeling, of grace. So these interpretive panels that move through the garden are organized by a series of themes: grief, reclamation, assertion, defiance, and empowerment. And those came from the co-developers and all of their work that they did with Gallaudet community members. Many of those engagements we were not in the room for. It wasn't comfortable or appropriate for us to be in the room for those. But those themes are kind of, there's stories, and there's a panel, and then there's a sculpture of a Black deaf individual signing this word. And grief, reclamation, assertion, defiance, empowerment are all in ASL. They all have this sort of fist symbol as a part. This one, I believe, is grief. But each of those use fists, which the kind of artists and the community really liked. So each of these figures you'd see will be signing one of those words as you get to each of those rooms. Here's an example of a kind of small group room, the theme of reclamation for that room. But again, I think just overall the memorial pathways, the sensory rooms really create this armature for storytelling and activism and the Black deaf experience.
I think building upon some of the themes that Maura just talked about, the Louise B. Miller Garden, we go back sort of local to Minneapolis with the Castile Peace Garden. Some of the work that we've been talking about, both in the sort of methods and in Maura's discussion of Gallaudet, really regarding sort of land, power, and storytelling, and how we begin to understand those pieces working collectively. This project is a product of around 4 years of worth of work on and off. This was mostly a pro bono project with the community and with the set of collaborators that we were invited to work with. This project is about celebrating the life of Philando Castile, whose life was taken by a police officer in Falcon Heights in 2016. So as I mentioned, our invitation with this team to join was by Formula Architects, who's one of our longtime collaborators in Minneapolis. They had been doing some ongoing engagement work. Their medium is fundamentally architecture. They do urban design work as well. We've been working on a series of community projects together. Also working with Seitu Jones, an artist in St. Paul, and the Castile family in Gray Hall. I'll also just mention a lot of times our work too within communities that are not our own are really in support of those communities, in support of those stories, and we work closely to make sure that we're contributing in ways that feel like a deep collaboration, that feel like deep support, and that's really important to us in how we work and how we show up. And sharing that with our staff is also important. So as we always begin our process, we had 3 fundamental questions that we worked together as a team. How can a process reconnect community through the act of rebuilding, reoccupying a site? How do you plan a space for healing, protest, and reconciliation? What are the limits of design to do that? How can both process and methods respect and bear witness to the site, stories, and the community? Also, we're finding in this project, I think, more nimble methods of working through a design process and a documentation process that translates an understanding of site into design work. So the principal mission of the project was to create a contemplative communal gathering space for peace, justice, and healing for all. I should also mention this work began before George Floyd's murder. There was a very different context. The site is within state fair land, so it's not public land. We'll get into that in a little bit. But we worked on a period of over, I mentioned 4 years, so really 4 phases of work: reading the ground, preparing the ground, building the garden, and tending the garden. And really, again, honoring Philando and his legacy. So the site is a very curious site. It was kind of in the middle, in between St. Paul and Minneapolis, and had a variety of sort of occupations. It became a state fair site in the early 20th century. It was, and still remains that to this day. In 1910, there was experimental flight happening there. They partnered with the Wright brothers to do flight demonstrations. There's a road that it was called Minneapolis Avenue that connects Minneapolis and St. Paul that was named after sort of a problematic figure, one of the founders of the cities, Larpenteur. It functioned as an airport for a long time until the state fair sort of grew. And then a developer came and named it Falcon Heights, thinking that would draw people. It's been kind of a strange town, didn't really draw people. It really feels like this rural suburban community in between these sort of 2 other communities. So in this first phase of work, sort of unpacking the story and all of its overlapping narratives, we also dove into the event itself, so holding that as part of it. In the most extreme example of sort of over-policing and violence, the site is also charged with Philando's death. And we were challenged to find ways of mapping, honoring, and reconstructing the story of that evening. And the representation of video and clips from the perspective of the officer and immediate portrayal of of this event. Within days, everyone around the world had access to these video clips, always from the officer's limited perspective, from the police vehicle. But there was something different about this event. I think that's important. The most fundamental shifts in perspective was when the perspective shifted from the dash cam to Diamond in the car with her daughter, live streaming the event across Facebook. Millions saw it, internationally. And that shifted the agency of the individual from outside the car to inside the car, which is important. I think we took this forward with us, in thinking about the power of individual agency in these situations. In the days and months following, there were protests across the nation, calls for action against police violence and justice for Philando's murder. And the site of this event became a place of gathering, healing, and celebration of Philando's life. We began our work pretty much 2 years after his death, and the site had become a beautiful place of a collection and community tending the garden that was there, and it would transform daily. It was a place of objects and memories and messages that were constantly changing and shifting with the seasons, and also with what was happening in the state, nationally and internationally. We challenge ourselves in our process and our observation and documentation methods and sharing this with our collaborators to allow for shifts in perspectives, for new knowledge to be gained about the site and the community. We set up a process of documentation, 2 of us in the project, over the course of pretty much till this day, we're still working on this, over the course of 2.5 years of photo documentation. So we could read the shifts through the seasons and the occupation, changing with respect to the site. So one person is out basically photographing from the site where Philando's car was marked to the left, walking 5 paces and taking an elevational shot every 5 paces. And then one person is on site just taking detail shots of the things that sort of emerged, the things that change. And so you can see this collage is showing you sort of a collapse of those pieces. This was also a process that was very hands-on. We worked directly with the community and our collaborators to organize work in this way. The site is also complicated, as I mentioned, because it's owned by the State Fair, so everything we were doing had to get approval from the State Fair. And so that was, I think, important. And they end up being very supportive in the process, but also know that this site is still on State Fair grounds. From Reading the Ground, our next phase of work was to plant a garden for the annual Restoration Day that celebrates Philando on the day of his death, which is July 6th. The idea that emerged from the community and design team was to plant a garden, an annual that they could harvest for the event and use in partnership with the installation artists of cut flowers. And this was the first day, May 26th, where we started preparing the soil, starting to build the garden. And we got word actually that afternoon that George Floyd had been murdered when we started making the garden. And we took a moment of pause. We all got together, had a prayer, and then got back to making the garden. We worked with the community to help water and tend the garden. We tended and weeded the garden for the first year. The city gave us a fire hydrant that we could use for watering. And then we had the garden ready for the first Restoration Day. The first event was pretty amazing, really well attended. The garden was full. We did harvest flowers from that to use. And we were also testing kind of the scale and situation of the garden for the program that would be coming forth. So we're doing kind of design at the same time as we're testing things and building out the garden. The garden took off. It was sort of amazing transformation. And then one day we came out and all of the objects and things that were placed on site in the art were removed. And we got a call from Valerie that she wanted to mow the garden. The design of the garden was happening concurrently, as I mentioned. It was, I think we were oftentimes going out and just measuring, again, finding nimble methods to scale some of the program we were talking about on site was really helpful given the amount of time we had to work on this project. So it's a long sort of linear site. It's about 50 feet deep by 450 feet long. The site was actually reconstructed in the 90s as part of a berm improvement project. So it had a kind of strange history and about 20 years of growth just on that edge. And grading and accessibility, of course, were really important to the site in creating a space that actually felt like it was within a garden on the edge of a busy road. So the site incorporated a number of design elements based on community input and site observation. There were many of the translations of the photographs that went into the sort of base elements. So the garden is really the whole entirety of the site, the setting for the whole project, and a symbolic mix of perennials, trees, and understory trees. The walk is a 400-foot-long healing walk that moves from the street through the garden and into the sort of central space where there is Philando's bench and the cosmogram. The cosmogram is a piece by Setu Jones, and it really represents the heart of the garden. This tells the story of Philando and his intersection with St. Paul and the community, his birth in St. Louis. The cosmogram is also an African prayer symbol which represents birth, life, and rebirth. The next piece of the garden is Philando's bench, is a place for people to connect with the story, with each other. The shape was based on a bench profile from the seat of Philando's car with a varied position to reflect sort of his life and journey. So modeling that profile from the 1997 Oldsmobile 88 that he drove. This is the groundbreaking on a rainy Restoration Day in 2021. The police didn't want to provide security for the event, so you can see cars were parked close and people were out of the rain. This is the site under construction in the summer of, late summer of 2020. And here's the site nearly complete under a blanket of snow in February 2022. So the next phase is really tending the garden. So the garden was finally complete early in the spring of 2022. Restoration Day was amazing this year. Again, the police stopped supporting the event the year before, but the site could finally hold the whole community that was coming out for the event, which was pretty amazing. The community continues to share responsibility for tending the garden. There are probably 3 or 4 garden keepers that live in and adjacent to the site. The site is always well kept, and they get help watering, and slowly the artifacts are beginning to show back up. This is a sunrise at the site in the middle of June. We can see the garden is starting to mature. You can see some of the Corten symbols in the background that were part of another design process to bring some more art and sort of meaning to the site. These are all African symbols. Here's the approach from the street, and the sidewalk kind of continues to be filled with art. I should also mention that the money for the project came from a series of grants, the St. Paul Foundation and others, but a lot of it was supported individually. The whole budget for the project was about $150,000. Valerie wanted more of the money to go to feed children for lunch than she did want to go into site work. So we worked hard to find materials that could stand up to, that were durable, that could stand up to use. This is a place that's salted, but also that had a kind of dignity about them, and was a place that could handle sort of events in an individual. You can see the cosmogram etched into the concrete in relation to the serviceberry and the tree and the bench. The grate was fabricated at Chicago Fire Arts, which is adjacent to George Floyd Square. The serviceberry tree came right down the road at a nursery about a half a mile away. And all the water that falls onto the site drains right towards the tree. So it doesn't actually need to be watered much. Also important to note is the shift in perspective that comes when you occupy the walk, the healing walk, that you're no longer, you're in between the street and you're along this sort of long linear path, of this 500-foot length site, and it shifts perspective. And also, we also maintained some of the existing elements that were placed in the site that were built. This was one of the first. This totem was one of the first items to come to the site, and so some of the other pieces we documented and curated, and they're still sitting in Valerie's garage. Some of them were part of an exhibition at Minneapolis Institute of Art. And one last shot of the garden on Restoration Day. You can see all this, the site filled. Again, everybody on the site, but people actually participating, sitting on the bench while Valerie is pouring water into the grate. And she says, this libation is for Philando. So with that, also just want to share, we spent a lot of time last year coming up with sort of our values and redefining sort of the mission that we continue to move this practice along. That's something that sort of underlies. This is a constant process of revisiting for us to make sure that we're working as a mission-based practice and that we are working towards our values. They inspire us every day. Thank you.